Introduction. Ancient Greek civilization c. 1600 Year BCE. 146 Year BCE. Between approximately 1600 Year BCE and 146 Year BCE, societies in the region of mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, and the surrounding coastal areas developed structures of political, military, and cultural organization that collectively constitute what modern scholarship identifies as ancient Greek civilization. These societies were connected through language, shared religious practices, and patterns of trade, but they also exhibited significant regional variation in settlement structure, governance, and social organization. The earliest identifiable Greek-speaking communities of this period are associated with fortified palace centers located on the mainland. These palaces functioned as hubs for administration, economic management, and military organization. Archaeological evidence indicates that the palaces contained extensive storage facilities for agricultural products and other commodities. Written records from these sites, preserved on clay tablets in Linear B script, record transactions, inventories, and administrative details, providing insight into the economic systems and bureaucratic operations of these early Greek-speaking societies. Settlement patterns during this early phase indicate a hierarchy of urban centers. Citadels such as Mycenae, Corinth, and Pylos were heavily fortified and positioned on elevated terrain for defensive purposes. Surrounding these citadels were smaller satellite settlements, often occupied by craft specialists, agricultural laborers, and military personnel associated with the central administration. The fortifications, including stone walls, gates, and defensive ditches, suggest that interpolity conflict and the protection of resources were significant considerations for these societies. Material culture from the period illustrates both domestic and ceremonial activities. Excavations have revealed large storage vessels, metalwork, pottery, and frescoes depicting scenes of ritual, hunting, and warfare. These artifacts indicate a combination of centralized control over production and specialized craftsmanship within the palace economy. Evidence of trade is present in imported goods, including metals, pottery, and luxury items, indicating interaction with regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. The circulation of such goods suggests the existence of both maritime and overland networks for the movement of resources, which would have supported the economic and political structures of these early societies. The period also exhibits clear evidence of organized military activity. Archaeological and textual sources indicate that the elite classes maintained specialized weapons and armor, the construction of defensive architecture, along with the presence of weapon caches and depictions of armed figures in artistic media, demonstrates that preparation for armed conflict was a persistent concern. These arrangements point to a society in which political authority and military capability were closely linked. The hierarchical structure of these societies, as inferred from palace size, burial practices, and administrative records, indicates that leadership was concentrated among a small number of elite families. Written records preserved in Linear B provide further details regarding administrative practice and economic regulation. These texts include inventories of livestock, agricultural produce, and other commodities, as well as lists of personnel associated with production, storage, and distribution. The tablets reveal that palace officials were responsible for the collection and allocation of resources, indicating a level of bureaucratic oversight consistent with complex societal organization. The use of a written script for these purposes provides evidence for literacy within administrative contexts and the formalization of economic practices. Religious and ceremonial practices are also visible in material remains. Palaces contain spaces interpreted as shrines or areas for ritual activity, sometimes associated with depictions of animal sacrifice or religious iconography. These facilities suggest that the management of religious practice was integrated with the administrative and economic functions of the palace. Religious observances may have served both social and political purposes, reinforcing the authority of ruling elites and providing structured occasions for communal activity. During this early phase, communication and transportation networks were established to connect settlements and facilitate the movement of goods and personnel. Roadways linking palatial centers to coastal areas and inland settlements facilitated both trade and military mobilization. Maritime routes connected Greek-speaking communities with regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, enabling the exchange of raw materials, finished products, and cultural influences. Archaeological evidence, including the presence of foreign artifacts within palatial contexts, confirms the use of these networks and the integration of these societies into broader regional systems. The period of early Greek civilization also included forms of artistic and architectural expression. Palaces and associated structures demonstrate the use of stone masonry, timber construction, and decorative elements such as frescoes and relief sculpture. These features indicate attention to both functional and aesthetic considerations in the construction of public and administrative spaces. Artifacts recovered from domestic and ceremonial contexts reveal stylistic continuity as well as variation among regions, reflecting localized traditions within a shared cultural framework. Demographic patterns during this period were shaped by the spatial distribution of settlements and the capacity of palatial centers to manage and mobilize resources. Population concentrations were highest in and around major palaces, while smaller settlements supported the production and collection of food, craft goods, and raw materials. Burial practices indicate differences in social status, with elite burials containing more substantial grave goods, including weapons, ornaments, and imported items. These patterns demonstrate the stratification of society and the differentiation of roles and privileges among inhabitants. By the end of this early phase, approximately 1100 year BC, many palatial centers had been abandoned or destroyed. Archaeological evidence indicates widespread structural collapse, including the dismantling of fortifications, the cessation of linear B record-keeping, and the depopulation of satellite settlements. This transition marks the end of the Mycenaean phase and the onset of the subsequent period commonly referred to as the Greek Dark Age. The mechanisms underlying this collapse remain the subject of scholarly analysis, but the result is a demonstrable reduction in settlement density, administrative complexity, and material output. Orientation cues are necessary for situating the developments of this early phase. The Mycenaean palaces were primarily located in the Peloponnesus, with additional centers on the Aegean islands. Environmental factors, including access to arable land, proximity to trade routes, and defensible terrain, influenced the placement and organization of these settlements. The geographical context shaped both economic and military strategies, while also providing conditions for the concentration of political authority. Throughout this period, multiple societal mechanisms operated in parallel. Administrative structures governed resource allocation. Fortifications and military organization maintained territorial security. Religious practices structured communal life and reinforced elite authority. Trade networks enabled economic exchange and access to specialized goods. Artistic and architectural activity reflected both functional and ceremonial priorities. These processes unfolded across multiple sites and regions, resulting in differentiated but interconnected communities that collectively constitute the early Greek-speaking civilization. Visualizable descriptions include the fortified walls of Mycenae with their Cyclopean masonry, storage magazines for grain and oil, linear B tablets laid out in administrative archives frescoed, walls depicting ceremonial and martial scenes, and coastal harbors facilitating the movement of trade vessels. Movement within these settlements included the transport of goods from storage to distribution, the organization of labor for construction and maintenance, and the mobilization of armed personnel for defense. Scale varied from small satellite villages to large palace complexes, indicating a hierarchical distribution of population and resources. In summary, between 1600 year BC and 1100 year BC, Greek-speaking communities developed complex societal structures characterized by centralized palatial authority, stratified social organization, fortified settlements, formalized administrative practices, economic exchange networks, religious and ceremonial institutions, and material culture reflecting both functional and symbolic priorities. These developments established the foundational framework for subsequent phases of ancient Greek civilization, providing mechanisms for governance, resource management, military organization, and cultural production that would influence later periods. And to Mycenaean Greece and the early Dark Age c. 1600 year BC to 800 year BC. Following the development of the earliest palatial societies in mainland Greece, the period traditionally labeled as Mycenaean Greece extended from approximately 1600 year BC to 1100 year BC. These societies, centralized around fortified citadels, exhibited complex administrative, military, economic, and ceremonial mechanisms. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Mycenae Turns and Pylos demonstrates that these centers were organized hierarchically, with palace complexes functioning as nodes of resource distribution, storage, and governance. The linear B tablets, preserved in palatial archives, provide extensive documentation of these administrative operations, recording inventories of agricultural produce, livestock, and manufactured goods, as well as personnel assigned to production and distribution activities. Palatial structures were characterized by cyclopean masonry, fortified walls, and elevated locations, offering both security and oversight of surrounding territories. The citadel at Mycenae, for example, includes defensive walls exceeding 6 meters in height, with gates designed to control movement and facilitate defense. Within these structures, specialized rooms served administrative, ceremonial, and storage functions. Storage magazines contained large pathoi, ceramic containers used to hold grain, oil, and other commodities. Frescoes and decorative elements within these palaces indicate attention to both functional and ceremonial requirements, including spaces interpreted as areas for ritual activity. These elements collectively demonstrate that political authority, economic management, and ceremonial practice were interrelated components of the Mycenaean palatial system. The social organization of Mycenaean society was stratified. Elite families or rulers maintained control over land, resources, and military forces. Burial practices, particularly the large tholos tombs and shaft graves found at Mycenae and other sites, indicate differences in status. Grave goods associated with elite burials include weapons, jewelry, imported items, and gold artifacts, reflecting both wealth and connections with external regions. The presence of imported materials, including bronze, ivory, and luxury goods, confirms that Mycenaean centers participated in extensive trade networks extending across the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. These trade networks facilitated the movement of both raw materials and finished goods, supporting both economic activity and political authority. Military organization was an integral component of Mycenaean society. Evidence from fortifications, weapon deposits, and artistic depictions of armed figures indicates that armed elites and palace-associated troops were maintained for defensive and offensive purposes. The design of defensive walls, gates, and citadel layouts reflects planning for potential armed conflict, while grave goods suggest that certain individuals were equipped for combat. The combination of strategic placement, fortification, and specialized personnel demonstrates the link between political authority and military capability. By the end of the Mycenaean palatial period, around 1100 year BC, evidence indicates widespread structural decline. Major citadels were destroyed, abandoned, or reduced in scale. Fortifications were left in disrepair, administrative record-keeping ceased, and many satellite settlements experienced depopulation. The causes of this transition remain the subject of archaeological study. The observable outcomes include a marked decrease in settlement density, the disappearance of linear B literacy, and a decline in material production. These changes mark the onset of what is conventionally referred to as the Greek Dark Age, extending roughly from 1100 year BC to 800 year BC. During the Dark Age, settlement patterns shifted. Population concentrations were smaller, and communities were often dispersed across defensible locations such as hills or coastal regions. Archaeological evidence indicates a reduction in complex palatial architecture and a return to simpler domestic structures, including small houses constructed from stone and timber. Pottery styles evolved from the elaborate frescoed and figurative designs of the Mycenaean period to geometric motifs, often characterized by repeated linear and angular patterns. These material changes suggest both a contraction in centralized production and shifts in social and cultural practices. Despite the reduction in urban and administrative complexity, mechanisms for survival and local governance persisted. Communities organized their own kinship groups, local elites, and regional councils. Resource management was likely conducted at the household or village level, with collective cooperation for agricultural production, storage, and defense. Archaeological evidence from storage pits, communal ovens, and defensive structures indicates that cooperation and localized planning were important for maintaining community stability. Trade and external contacts were reduced during the early Dark Age, but some evidence indicates continued interaction with neighboring regions. Pottery styles, metal objects, and other artifacts show influence from the Eastern Mediterranean, suggesting that limited exchange persisted even in the absence of centralized palatial administration. These interactions were likely smaller in scale and less systematically organized than during the Mycenaean palatial period, but demonstrate the continued movement of goods and ideas. The transition from the Dark Age to the Archaic period, beginning approximately 800 Year BCE, is marked by the reemergence of urban centers, the formation of city-states polis, and the gradual development of alphabetic writing derived from Phoenician scripts. These developments indicate the restoration of complex administrative and social structures. During this period, communities increasingly engaged in organized trade, colonization of Mediterranean coastal regions, and the establishment of political and military institutions characteristic of the Archaic period. Archaeological data from cemeteries and settlement remains indicate evolving social stratification during the early Archaic period. Grave sizes and goods suggest emerging distinctions in wealth and status, though the stratification was less rigid than in Mycenaean palaces. Settlement patterns show the establishment of fortified sites, sometimes referred to as acropolies, which served both defensive and communal functions. These structures indicate renewed attention to territorial security and administrative coordination. Military organization during the transition into the Archaic period included adoption of hoplite-style warfare. Archaeological and textual evidence from later sources describe heavily armed infantry, organized in phalanx formations. Supported by citizen soldiers drawn from local populations, the phalanx relied on coordination, discipline, and collective action, indicating that military preparedness was integrated into civic structures and social expectations. Artistic and material culture evolved during the early Archaic period. Geometric pottery dominates the archaeological record, often with consistent patterns applied across entire regions. Decorative motifs include linear arrangements, meanders, and concentric circles. The production of such pottery indicates specialized craft activity and standardization, suggesting continuity and technical skill even in the absence of centralized palatial economies. In addition, the production of small-scale bronze figurines and other artifacts demonstrates the persistence of craft specialization and ritual practice. Religious and ceremonial practices during this period are inferred from architectural remains, votive offerings, and burial practices. Sanctuaries and shrines are located both within settlements and at natural sites such as springs and elevated locations. Offerings include figurines, pottery, and small metal objects, suggesting structured ritual activity. These practices functioned as part of the social and cultural cohesion of communities, reinforcing local authority structures and communal identity. Trade during the Dark Age and early Archaic period was both regional and limited in scale. Archaeological evidence shows the distribution of pottery types, metalwork, and other artifacts across settlement clusters, indicating local exchange networks. Maritime trade began to increase as communities established coastal settlements and colonies in regions such as southern Italy, Sicily, and the western Aegean. These early networks set the stage for more extensive exchange systems characteristic of later Archaic Greece. By approximately 800 Year BCE, the mechanisms of political organization, economic exchange, and social stratification were sufficiently re-established to allow for the emergence of recognizable city street-8s. The combination of fortified settlements, organized military forces, structured craft production, and regional trade networks constituted the institutional framework that would define the Archaic Period. This transition marks the conclusion of the early Dark Age and the establishment of enduring structures for Greek civilization. Orientation cues throughout this period include the shift from palatial centers in the Peloponnesus and central mainland Greece to dispersed settlements, fortified villages, and emerging coastal colonies. Spatial organization varied by terrain, with inland settlements emphasizing defensibility and access to arable land, and coastal sites facilitating maritime interaction. Scale ranged from small family or kin-based settlements to larger fortified villages, indicating differing levels of social and administrative complexity. Movement within and between settlements included agricultural production, craft specialization, and trade, all coordinated within local and regional networks. Visualizable descriptions suitable for edutainment include cyclopean walls of abandoned palaces, simplified domestic dwellings of the Dark Age, geometric pottery with repeating linear motifs, storage pits and communal facilities, fortified acropolis of early archaic settlements, and coastal harbors used for emerging trade routes. Maps showing the geographic distribution of settlements, movement of goods, and locations of colonies provide spatial context and demonstrate the integration of these communities into regional networks. Segment 3: Greece, interstate conflict, political systems, and institutional development. 480 year BC. 323 year BC. By 480 year BC, the Greek world consisted of independent city-states, or polis, distributed across mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, and the western coast of Anatolia. Each polis functioned as a sovereign political unit, maintaining its own laws, military forces, and civic institutions. Among these, Athens and Sparta held the greatest military and political influence during the early classical period. In 480 year BC, the Persian Empire launched a large-scale invasion of mainland Greece. Land forces advanced through northern and central regions, while naval forces operated along the coastline. Greek polis formed a temporary military coalition in response. Defensive engagements occurred on both land and sea. A land force attempted to delay the Persian advance at a narrow mountain pass. Naval engagements took place in nearby coastal waters. Later that year, a decisive naval battle occurred within confined straits, where Greek triremes maneuvered to restrict numerical advantage. In 479 year BC, coordinated land and naval engagements resulted in the withdrawal of Persian forces from mainland Greece and the Aegean. Following these events, military coordination among certain polis continued. In 478 year BC, a maritime alliance formed under Athenian leadership. Member states contributed ships or financial payments. The alliance initially operated to secure Aegean waters and deter further Persian operations. Administrative oversight gradually centralized, tribute assessments were standardized, and the alliance treasury was transferred from its original island location to Athens. Naval forces were coordinated through Athenian command structures. Attempts by member states to withdraw were met with enforcement actions, resulting in consolidation of Athenian authority. During the mid-5th century year BC, Athens expanded civic infrastructure and public construction. Revenues derived from maritime trade and alliance tribute supported large-scale architectural projects on elevated urban ground. Democratic institutions continued to operate. The assembly served as a decision-making body composed of male citizens. A council prepared legislative proposals. Magistrates were selected by lot for many public offices, while large juries participated in judicial proceedings. Compensation for public service facilitated broader citizen participation in governance. Sparta maintained a distinct political structure. Its governing framework included dual kingship, a council of elders, annually elected supervisory officials, and an assembly of male citizens. Spartan society emphasized collective military training and land-based economic organization. Agricultural labor was largely performed by dependent populations. Military organizations centered on heavily armed infantry units trained for coordinated action in dense formations. As Athenian influence expanded across the Aegean, tensions between major alliances increased. Divergent political systems, alliance obligations, and strategic interests contributed to instability among polis. In 431 year BC, large-scale armed conflict began between the Athenian-led maritime alliance and the Spartan-led land-based alliance network. This conflict extended across mainland Greece, the Aegean basin, and western regions. During the initial phase of the war, Spartan forces conducted repeated land invasions of Athenian territory. Athens relied on defensive walls connecting the urban center to its port, ensuring continued maritime supply and naval operations. Naval engagements and economic disruption affected allied states on both sides, and 421 year BC. A negotiated truce temporarily reduced large-scale operations but did not eliminate alliance tensions. And 415 year BC. Athens launched a major naval expedition toward Sicily. The campaign required extensive mobilization of ships, personnel, and logistical support. Over time, Athenian forces encountered operational setbacks and supply constraints. Reinforcements failed to secure control. By 413 year BC, the expedition concluded with destruction of the fleet and capture of surviving forces. Following this outcome, Spartan leadership adjusted strategy. Financial assistance from Persian regional authorities enabled expansion of Spartan naval capacity. Maritime operations intensified across the eastern Aegean. In 405 year BC, a decisive naval engagement disrupted Athenian supply routes. In 404 year BC, Athens surrendered. Defensive fortifications were dismantled, and Spartan influence expanded across former Athenian territories. Spartan dominance did not remain uncontested. During the early 4th century year BC, other polis challenged Spartan authority. Armed conflict among shifting coalitions altered the regional balance of power. In 371 year BC, a major land battle resulted in defeat of a Spartan army and reduction of Spartan dominance. A rival polis expanded influence temporarily and reorganized alliance structures across central Greece. Throughout the classical period, military organization evolved while retaining core structural principles. The hoplite phalanx remained central to land warfare. Citizen soldiers equipped with shields, spears, and armor formed compact ranks designed for coordinated advance, terrain, cohesion, and supply-influenced outcomes. Naval warfare relied on triremes powered by oarsmen arranged in tiers. Maneuverability, coordinated rowing, and ramming tactics determined engagement results. Fortifications, including city walls and defensive outposts, were reinforced across multiple regions in response to prolonged conflict. Political systems diversified during the 4th century year BC. Democratic, oligarchic, and mixed constitutional forms operated among various polis. Transitions between systems occurred under internal pressure or external intervention. Assemblies, councils, magistracies, and courts functioned as institutional mechanisms for legislation, administration, and adjudication, citizenship qualifications, property requirements, and military obligations differed among city-states. Economic systems combined agriculture, maritime trade, and craft production. Coinage became standardized across many regions, facilitating exchange. Urban markets operated within fortified centers, while ports supported regional and long-distance trade. Agricultural estates produced grain, olives, and grapes. Workshops manufactured pottery, metal goods, textiles, and tools. Labor systems incorporated citizens, resident foreigners, and enslaved populations. Cultural and intellectual activity operated within civic frameworks. Theaters hosted dramatic performances during religious festivals. Stone temples and public buildings reflected proportional architectural planning. Sculpture developed increased attention to anatomical representation and balanced stance. Organized schools of philosophical inquiry engaged in systematic examination of ethics, politics, natural processes, and logic. Educational practices included rhetoric, mathematics, and music. Written historical accounts documented military campaigns and interstate relations. Public inscriptions recorded decrees, treaties, tribute assessments, and financial accounts. Literacy functioned primarily within administrative and elite contexts but expanded in scope compared to earlier centuries. By the mid-4th century Year BC, sustained interstate conflict had reduced stability among southern Greek polis. Alliances shifted frequently. Military expenditures and demographic strain altered local capacities. In northern Greece, political consolidation strengthened a centralized kingdom. Military organization incorporated longer pikes within infantry formations and coordinated cavalry units. Diplomatic engagement with southern polis increased alongside military preparation. In 338 Year BC, forces from the northern kingdom confronted a coalition of southern Greek polis in central Greece. The resulting battle ended with defeat of the coalition. A league framework was subsequently established, preserving local civic administration while aligning military policy under centralized leadership. Independent interstate warfare among major southern polis effectively ceased under this arrangement. Between 480 Year BC and 323 Year BC, the classical period encompassed recurring cycles of alliance formation, interstate warfare, institutional adaptation, and civic development. Political authority remained centered on the polis as the primary unit of governance. Military systems adapted to technological and strategic demands. Economic networks expanded or contracted in response to stability and maritime control. Geographically, activity extended from mainland Greece to the Aegean Islands, western Anatolia, southern Italy, and Sicily, mountain passes, coastal straits, and fortified urban centers shaped strategic planning. Maritime corridors connected trade hubs and naval bases. Population density increased in major urban centers during periods of economic expansion. Visualizable elements include compact hoplite formations advancing across open terrain, triremes maneuvering within narrow straits, fortified walls linking urban centers to ports, assemblies convening in open civic spaces, standardized coinage circulating through marketplaces, and inscriptions carved into stone documenting public decrees. By 323 Year BC, the political configuration of the Greek world had shifted from a system dominated by autonomous interstate rivalry to one operating within a centralized league structure under northern and leadership. Civic institutions developed during the classical period: assemblies, courts, military coordination systems, and maritime trade networks remained operational within this reorganized political framework. Segment for BC. By 336 Year BC, political authority in Macedon had been consolidated under a centralized monarchy in northern Greece. Military reforms implemented during the preceding decades had reorganized infantry structure, cavalry coordination, and siege capabilities. The Macedonian army combined long pike infantry formations with companion cavalry units and specialized engineering divisions. Administrative authority operated through royal officials, regional governors, and tribute systems. Diplomatic arrangements connected Macedon to southern Greek polis through a league framework that aligned military policy under centralized leadership while preserving local civic administration. In 336 Year BCE, succession to the Macedonian throne occurred following the assassination of the reigning monarch. The new ruler secured authority through consolidation of internal support and reaffirmation of control over dependent territories. Southern Greek polis that had previously entered the league framework were required to reaffirm allegiance. Military expeditions were conducted to suppress revolts and secure borders in northern and central Greece. These actions stabilized internal administration prior to external campaigns. In 334 Year BC, Macedonian forces crossed into Anatolia, initiating a large-scale campaign against territories controlled by the Persian Empire. The army included infantry equipped with long sarissa, cavalry units positioned on flanks, light infantry contingents, and siege engineers. Supply lines extended across the Hellespont, linking European bases to advancing forces. Early engagements occurred along river crossings, where coordinated infantry advance and cavalry maneuver secured territorial footholds in western Anatolia. Following initial victories, coastal cities were incorporated into Macedonian control, garrisons were installed to maintain security, and existing administrative systems were either retained under supervision or replaced with appointed officials. Tribute arrangements and taxation systems were reorganized to support continued military operations. Naval strategy focused on neutralizing Persian maritime bases by securing coastal ports rather than direct fleet confrontation. By 333 Year BC, the Macedonian army advanced inland towards central Anatolia and southern regions. A major engagement occurred near a narrow coastal plain, where coordinated infantry pressure and cavalry movement disrupted Persian defensive alignment. The outcome opened access to eastern Mediterranean territories. Urban centers across Syria and Phoenicia were brought under control through a combination of negotiation and siege operations. Engineering divisions constructed siege towers, battering rams, and earthworks to overcome fortified positions. In 332 Year BCE, operations extended southward along the Levantine coast. A prolonged siege of an island city required construction of a causeway to enable direct assault. Following its capture, the Macedonian army proceeded into Egypt. Local administrative elites transferred authority without large-scale resistance. The territory was reorganized within the expanding imperial framework. A new urban center was founded along the Nile Delta coastline, designed with a grid layout and harbor infrastructure to facilitate maritime trade and administrative coordination. In 331 Year BC, the campaign shifted eastward toward Mesopotamia. A decisive battle occurred on open terrain, where the Macedonian phalanx advanced in coordinated formation while cavalry units targeted opposing flanks. The outcome disrupted Persian command structures and enabled occupation of major administrative capitals. Treasury reserves were secured, and regional governance structures were reorganized under Macedonian supervision. Satrapal appointments were maintained in some areas, while new officials were installed in others. Administrative continuity was balanced with centralized oversight. Following consolidation in Mesopotamia, the army advanced into eastern provinces, including regions corresponding to modern Iran and Central Asia. Campaigns during 330 to 327 Year BC involved extended operations across mountainous terrain and river valleys. Resistance movements required garrison placement and construction of fortified settlements. Urban foundations were established at strategic crossroads to secure supply routes and communication networks. These settlements incorporated military colonies populated by veterans and administrators. In 327 Year BC, the Macedonian army crossed into northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent. Engagements occurred along major rivers. Tactical formations adjusted to local terrain and opposing forces. Siege operations and negotiated settlements resulted in incorporation of additional territories. By 326 Year BC, the army reached the Hyphasis River. Troop fatigue and logistical constraints limited further eastern advance. The army subsequently began westward movement. The return march between 325 and 324 Year BC followed multiple routes. One division traveled by sea along the Persian Gulf, while land forces traversed arid regions. Engineering units constructed wells and supply depots along desert corridors. Losses occurred due to environmental conditions, but coordinated regrouping enabled reassembly in Mesopotamia. Administrative reforms continued during this period, including integration of local elites into imperial command structures and standardization of taxation systems. In 324 Year BC, policies were implemented to promote administrative cohesion across diverse territories. Military officers were reassigned to regional commands. Intermarriage ceremonies were organized between Macedonian personnel and local elites to facilitate political integration. Coinage bearing standardized symbols circulated across the empire, supporting economic unification. Road networks connecting Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and eastern provinces facilitated communication and troop movement. By 323 year BC, the Macedonian Empire extended from mainland Greece across Anatolia, Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Persia, and into parts of Central and South Asia. Governance operated through a combination of Macedonian military oversight and retention of existing bureaucratic systems. Tribute collection, tax assessment, and coinage regulation supported fiscal administration. Garrisons stationed in key cities maintained order and protected trade routes. Military organization during this period combined the Sarissa-based phalanx, heavy cavalry, light infantry, archers, and siege engineers. Coordination between infantry and cavalry allowed flexible battlefield response. Siegecraft expanded with use of torsion-powered artillery and movable towers. Naval operations supported coastal campaigns and secured maritime supply corridors. Logistics relied on prepositioned depots, requisitioning of local resources, and establishment of fortified waypoints. Urban development accelerated across the empire. Newly founded cities were constructed with orthogonal street plans, public squares, administrative buildings, and defensive walls. These settlements functioned as military bases, administrative centers, and commercial hubs. Greek language and coinage circulated widely within these urban environments, facilitating communication and trade among diverse populations. Cultural exchange accompanied territorial expansion. Religious sanctuaries, temples, and civic institutions incorporated both local and Greek architectural forms. Artistic production blended stylistic elements from multiple regions. Administrative documents were produced in Greek alongside local languages in some territories. Trade networks linked Mediterranean ports with inland markets, enabling movement of grain, metals, textiles, and luxury goods. Geographically, the campaign routes traversed coastal plains, mountain passes, river valleys, deserts, and steppe regions. Control of river crossings and port facilities determined strategic movement. Seasonal timing influenced campaign schedules. Garrisons positioned along major routes secured communication between western and eastern provinces. By 323 year BC, centralized authority remained concentrated in the royal court at Babylon. Administrative integration of vast territories required delegation to regional commanders. Military units were distributed across provinces to maintain order and protect supply lines. Economic coordination depended on standardized taxation and circulation of silver coinage. Visualizable elements suitable for narration include dense infantry formations advancing with extended pikes, cavalry units maneuvering along open flanks, siege towers rising beside fortified walls, causeways constructed across shallow coastal waters, newly laid urban grids along riverbanks, caravans transporting supplies across desert corridors, and standardized coinage stamped with imperial symbols circulating through marketplaces from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. Between 336 year BC and 323 year BC, Macedonian expansion transformed the political geography of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Independent Greek polis operated within a league system aligned to centralized leadership. Former Persian territories were reorganized under imperial administration. Military, fiscal, and urban systems were integrated across a transcontinental framework. At the close of 323 year BC, the empire encompassed multiple linguistic, cultural, and economic regions unified through military oversight, administrative coordination, and shared urban networks. The territorial configuration established during this period defined the structural basis for subsequent political developments across the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. In 323 BC, the vast Macedonian Empire, forged by conquest, faced a crisis of command. With its central leadership gone, the world's largest empire began to fracture. A new era dawned, not of unity, but of fragmentation. The generals and governors left behind, once comrades in arms, became rivals, carving out kingdoms for themselves from the colossal inheritance. This was the dawn of the Hellenistic Age, a turbulent period of conflict, innovation, and profound cultural change, culminating in the rise of a new power from the West, Rome. Immediately after the empire's center dissolved, regional authorities scrambled to secure their domains. Military garrisons became the arbiters of power, holding strategic cities and vital trade routes. The dream of a unified empire gave way to the reality of regional kingdoms, each vying for supremacy. From the fertile Nile Valley in Egypt to the rugged mountains of Anatolia, a new political map was being drawn, not with ink, but with steel. Limited coordination between these new realms meant that overlapping claims often erupted into open warfare. Fortifications were strengthened, and coastal garrisons stood vigilant, marking the front lines of a fractured world. The initial phase of this new order, from 323 to 305 BC, was a mad dash for consolidation. The successors focused on securing the economic heartlands of the empire, the bustling coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean, and the rich agricultural lands of Egypt. Harbors were fortified, and naval squadrons began patrolling the sea lanes, protecting the flow of grain and goods that were the lifeblood of their fledgling kingdoms. Inland, new settlements were built along major roads, garrisoned to project power into the countryside. A hybrid system of governance emerged, blending old local traditions with new military oversight. Tribute systems were standardized, not just to fund armies, but to build the very foundations of these new states. The armies of this era still marched in the long shadow of Macedonian military genius. The fearsome pike phalanx remained the core of every army, a dense forest of steel-tipped spears. But it was supported by increasingly sophisticated cavalry and light infantry. Logistics, the unglamorous key to military success, were managed through a network of supply depots and secured roads. Generals had to be masters of terrain, adapting their tactics to river valleys, mountain passes, and coastal plains. The classic maneuvers of the past, the decisive flank attack, the unbreakable phalanx, the coordination of different troop types were honed to a fine art in the crucible of constant conflict. By 305 BC, the gloves came off. Large-scale wars erupted between the major successor kingdoms. The prize was nothing less than total dominance. The conflicts were a brutal mix of open field battles and grueling sieges. Great cities, the centers of wealth and culture, became strategic targets. Some fell quickly, their gates opened by diplomacy or treachery. Others endured months-long sieges, surrounded by colossal war machines. Towers rolled towards their walls, battering rams hammered at their gates, and artillery rained down a storm of stone. Once a city was taken, its administrative systems were either absorbed or replaced, integrating the conquered territory into the victor's expanding realm. Amidst the chaos of war, a remarkable process of cultural integration was underway between 300 and 280 BC. New cities rose from the ground, and old ones were transformed. Urban planning followed a new, orderly vision, straight streets laid out in grid patterns, grand public squares, and fortified citadels watching over sprawling harbors. A common currency, stamped with the symbols of the new rulers, circulated across vast distances, knitting the fragmented world together through trade. In temples and public buildings, Greek architectural styles blended with local traditions, creating a vibrant, hybrid culture. Education flourished in urban centers, where schools of mathematics, rhetoric, and philosophy preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of the past. Theaters, libraries, and markets became the bustling heart of civic life. This was also an age of incredible scientific and intellectual achievement. In cities like Alexandria, new institutions dedicated to research were founded. Observatories tracked the stars, botanical gardens cataloged the natural world, and laboratories facilitated systematic study in fields like medicine and geography. Philosophical schools weren't just for quiet contemplation, they were arenas for rigorous debate on ethics, logic, and the nature of good governance. The discoveries and debates of this era were meticulously documented on papyrus scrolls and stone inscriptions, creating a repository of knowledge that would influence the world for centuries. But peace was fleeting. Between 280 and 250 BC, competition between the successor states intensified. Resources were becoming scarce, and strategic pressures mounted. Campaigns were launched to seize contested borderlands, vital trade hubs, and strategic island fortresses. Naval power was decisive. Control of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean sea lanes meant control over trade, resources, and the ability to move armies rapidly. Fleets blockaded enemy ports, launched amphibious assaults, and fought for maritime supremacy. On land, the familiar dance of phalanx, cavalry, and siegecraft continued, with engineers devising ever more elaborate machines to overcome city walls. To fund these endless wars, administrative and financial systems became more sophisticated. Coinage was standardized to streamline interregional commerce. Ports and roads were meticulously maintained, not just for trade, but to ensure the swift movement of troops and supplies. To maintain stability in their diverse realms, rulers often incorporated local elites into their governments, giving them a stake in the new order. The relentless collection of tribute and the careful management of agriculture ensured a steady flow of resources to sustain the machinery of war and the splendor of the Hellenistic cities. Even as great kingdoms battled for supremacy, the city-states of southern Greece, the polis, maintained a semblance of their old independence between 250 and 200 BC. They still governed themselves with assemblies and councils, but they did so under the watchful eye of a regional overlord. Their defensive walls were kept in good repair, and their military obligations were clearly defined. They coordinated their navies to protect shared trade routes and relied on the garrisons of their more powerful neighbors for protection against external threats. A fragile balance of autonomy and obligation. Then, a new shadow fell across the world. Between 200 and 180 BC, a powerful republic from the western Mediterranean began to assert its influence, Rome. Its arrival sent shockwaves through the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Greek cities scrambled to prepare, reinforcing their fortifications, stockpiling supplies, and mobilizing their fleets. They deployed their armies, positioning infantry, cavalry, and archers to defend their homeland. But they were facing a new kind of military power, one with discipline, organization, and an insatiable appetite for expansion. The shift in power was progressive, but relentless. From 180 to 150 BC, Rome's influence spread across southern Greece. Cities and territories were steadily incorporated into its growing administrative and military system. Local governments were allowed to persist, but their power was limited to civic administration and tax collection. The urban landscape retained its Hellenistic character, but the economic networks were now reoriented to serve a new master. The fragmented world of the successor kings was being methodically absorbed into a new, unified empire. By 146 BC, the process was complete. The last vestiges of Hellenistic independence in Greece were extinguished. Roman garrisons now stood guard in the great cities and along the strategic coastlines. Trade routes, supply networks, and tax systems were all centralized under Roman authority. Yet, the legacy of the Hellenistic age endured. The administrative structures, the urban infrastructure, the economic networks, and the military organization developed over the preceding 2 centuries were not destroyed, but adapted. They became the foundation upon which Rome built its Eastern Empire, a testament to the enduring ingenuity and resilience of the Hellenistic world. Looking back, the period from 323 to 146 BC was a whirlwind of creation and destruction. It was an age where military conflict spurred administrative innovation, and urbanization fostered cultural and scientific breakthroughs. The phalanx, the siege tower, the gridded city, the public library. The standardized coin, these were the building blocks of a world caught between the legacy of one great empire and the dawn of another. The Hellenistic period, born from the fragmentation of Macedonian power, ultimately paved the way for the unification of the Mediterranean world under Rome, shaping the course of history for centuries to come. Segment 6: Legacy and Conclusion of Ancient Greek Civilization c. 1600 year BC 146 year BC By 146 year BC, the political configuration of the Greek world had shifted from a landscape dominated by independent city-states and Hellenistic successor regions to incorporation within the administrative and military structures of a Western Mediterranean authority. Despite the loss of political autonomy, Greek institutional, cultural, and intellectual frameworks persisted across urban centers, ports, and rural territories. This persistence ensured the transmission of Hellenic systems into subsequent eras of governance, commerce, and scholarship. Military organization established during the classical and Hellenistic periods remained operational within integrated frameworks. Infantry formations continued to employ phalanx-based principles, incorporating shields, spears, and coordinated ranks. Cavalry units provided tactical mobility along flanks and open terrain. Light infantry and missile troops supported infantry cohesion. Garrison settlements, fortified acropolis, and coastal naval bases maintained territorial control and secured critical supply routes. Logistics relied on roads connecting urban centers, prepositioned depots, and maritime transport, ensuring both mobility and operational continuity. Urban infrastructure developed over the course of the Greek civilization provided functional models for later governance. Cities featured orthogonal street grids, centralized marketplaces, public squares, administrative buildings, temples, and defensive walls. Harbor infrastructure allowed trade and troop movement across the Aegean and Mediterranean. Standardized coinage facilitated economic integration, providing a medium for taxation, trade, and public finance. Administrative records, including inscriptions, tax registers, and public decrees, supported fiscal monitoring and institutional continuity. Cultural institutions established during the Greek period, temples, theaters, libraries, and educational facilities continued to operate under adapted oversight structures. Dramatic performance, historical documentation, and philosophical study remained central to civic life. Schools of thought, including systematic investigation of ethics, logic, and natural phenomena, persisted in urban centers and provided frameworks for subsequent scholarship. Public libraries and archives maintained collections of texts, administrative records, and scientific observations, enabling continuity of knowledge transmission. Scientific practice during the Hellenistic and final Greek periods included observation, experimentation, and theoretical development. Urban observatories facilitated astronomical measurement, while anatomical studies and medical experimentation were conducted in institutionalized settings. Engineering knowledge, including construction techniques, siegecraft, hydraulic systems, and road networks, supported both civic administration and military operations. Mathematical methods, geometric constructions, and surveying principles underpinned architectural planning and urban organization. Trade networks established by Greek polities extended across the Mediterranean and into Western Asia, Egypt, and the Aegean Islands. Maritime routes connected ports, enabling transport of grain, metals, textiles, and luxury goods. Inland routes linked agricultural production centers to urban markets and administrative nodes. Economic activity was supported by standardized coinage and regional fiscal integration. Marketplaces served as centers for exchange, distribution, and monitoring of supply, ensuring stability of goods and resources across territories. Political institutions developed during the Greek period. Assemblies, councils, courts, and magistracies continued to function under adapted authority. Civic administration incorporated elements of prior democratic, oligarchic, and mixed systems, facilitating local governance within overarching frameworks. Legal codes, property regulations, and tax collection procedures maintained continuity, enabling orderly management of population centers and economic activity. Urban administration balanced local autonomy with integration into regional and imperial governance. Artistic production developed over Greek history maintained stylistic and structural principles. Sculpture emphasized proportion, anatomical representation, and balanced composition. Architecture adhered to post and lintel construction, precise measurement, and proportional design. Public buildings, temples, theaters, and stoas reflected functional planning alongside aesthetic considerations. Decorative motifs, sculptural reliefs, and ceramic production retained identifiable Hellenic characteristics while incorporating local influences from newly integrated regions. Philosophical traditions continued to shape intellectual frameworks. Schools of inquiry engaged in the systematic study of logic, natural phenomena, ethics, mathematics, and politics. Pedagogical practices, including rhetorical instruction, dialectical reasoning, and observational study, were institutionalized in urban centers. Public discourse on civic, ethical, and natural topics remained organized and methodical, contributing to continuity of structured knowledge despite shifts in political oversight. During this final period, cultural integration facilitated dissemination of Greek language, coinage, administrative practices, and urban planning across multiple regions. Urban settlements functioned as nodes of political, military, economic, and cultural activity. Standardization of measures, weights, and coinage enabled long-distance trade and fiscal coordination, maritime and inland transport. Infrastructure supported movement of goods, personnel, and communication between cities and administrative centers. Military, political, economic, and cultural structures maintained by Greek civilization formed the basis for subsequent institutional developments in integrated territories, training systems, tactical doctrines, and logistical procedures were retained by occupying authorities. Urban organization, administrative frameworks, and fiscal mechanisms were preserved and adapted to new governing authorities, ensuring operational continuity and structural stability. Visualizable elements suitable for documentary narration include infantry formations advancing in coordinated phalanx, cavalry maneuvering along urban perimeters or open terrain, fortified acropolis overlooking harbors, garrisoned roads and depots, urban street grids connecting marketplaces and administrative buildings, naval vessels patrolling trade corridors, coins circulating through marketplaces, public libraries, observatories, and theaters functioning as civic centers, and temples and civic structures reflecting Hellenic architectural principles. Geographically, influence extended from mainland Greece to the Aegean Islands, southern Anatolia, Egypt, the Levant, and western Mediterranean maritime corridors. Coastal ports, river valleys, mountain passes, and fortified urban centers determine the spatial organization of trade, military deployment, and administrative control. Seasonal variation influenced campaign timing, supply movement, and agricultural productivity. By 146 Year BCE, the Greek world had undergone a full transition from autonomous city-states to integrated territories under external administrative and military control. Despite the loss of political independence, Greek civic, military, economic, and cultural frameworks persisted. Urban planning, infrastructure, administrative practice, scientific observation, philosophical inquiry, artistic production, and trade networks continued to operate, providing a structural and organizational foundation for subsequent civilizations. The Hellenic legacy influenced political, cultural, and intellectual development in multiple regions. Administrative systems provided models for urban management, taxation, and legal oversight. Military organization informed troop structure, tactical doctrine, and logistical procedures. Economic frameworks, including standardized coinage and trade networks, facilitated regional integration. Civic and cultural institutions sustained structured education, artistic production, and systematic study of natural phenomena. Urban settlement patterns, infrastructure, and fortification principles guided future city planning and architectural development. Knowledge transmission maintained continuity across centuries. Libraries, archives, observatories, and schools preserved written records, scientific observation, and civic documentation. Philosophical and mathematical study, systematic investigation, and empirical observation ensured retention of structured methods and intellectual frameworks. These frameworks influenced administrative, scientific, and cultural practices in subsequent historical periods. Scientific, military, and administrative systems remained interconnected. Urban infrastructure supported logistical supply, troop movement, and communication. Fortified settlements, garrisoned roads, and coastal ports enabled coordinated operational capability. Observatories, laboratories, and educational institutions facilitated systematic study of natural phenomena and practical application of engineering and architectural knowledge. Coinage and taxation mechanisms underpinned economic stability, trade, and administrative efficiency. Civic and cultural continuity provided a framework for identity and institutional memory. Public spaces, administrative offices, theaters, libraries, and religious structures reinforce structured activity, social coordination, and knowledge dissemination. Educational practices, including systematic study of mathematics, rhetoric, and philosophy, persisted within civic institutions. Documentation of military campaigns, legal records, and fiscal activity preserved operational knowledge for future generations. Between c. 1600 year BC and 146 year BC, Greek civilization developed integrated systems of governance, military organization, economic management, cultural production, and scientific observation. Despite political fragmentation, conquest, and integration under external authority, these systems maintained operational continuity and structural integrity. Civic, military, and cultural frameworks provided models for administration, urban planning, military operations, trade networks, and intellectual inquiry across subsequent historical periods. Visualizable narrative cues include fortified urban centers, orthogonal street grids, marketplaces, harbor facilities, infantry and cavalry formations conducting maneuvers, siege engines positioned alongside city walls, libraries, observatories, and schools in operation. Administrative buildings functioning as hubs for governance, coinage moving through trade networks, roads and supply depots connecting multiple urban centers, and temples and civic structures reflecting Hellenic architectural design. By 146 year BC, the culmination of Greek civilization established durable structural, institutional, and cultural patterns. Military, administrative, economic, civic, scientific, and artistic systems persisted under new governance, forming the foundation for Roman integration and subsequent European and Mediterranean institutional frameworks. The period solidified the operational, cultural, and intellectual legacy of Greek civilization, ensuring its transmission across geographic and temporal boundaries. Segment 7, Legacy and Conclusion of Ancient Greek Civilization c. 1600 year BC 146 year BC. By 146 year BC, the political structure of the Greek world had undergone a comprehensive transformation. Independent city-states and Hellenistic successor regions had been incorporated into a centralized administrative and military system under a Western Mediterranean authority. Despite the loss of autonomous governance, Greek institutional, cultural, and intellectual frameworks persisted, continuing to influence urban planning, civic administration, military organization, scientific observation, and economic management across integrated territories. These systems ensured the structured transmission of Hellenic knowledge and operational practices into subsequent historical periods. Military organization established over the preceding centuries remained operational within the newly integrated framework. Infantry formations continued to employ phalanx principles, coordinated ranks, shield wall cohesion, and tactical alignment. Cavalry units maintained operational mobility along flanks, enabling rapid engagement across open terrain. Light infantry and missile troops supported primary formations, maintaining operational flexibility. Fortified settlements, acropolis, and coastal garrisons enabled territorial control and rapid reinforcement of strategic points. Logistic networks relied on road systems connecting urban centers, prepositioned depots, and maritime transport to ensure operational continuity over extended regions. Urban infrastructure developed during the Classical and Hellenistic periods continued to function effectively. Cities featured orthogonal street grids, centralized marketplaces, administrative offices, temples, theaters, and defensive walls. Harbor infrastructure facilitated maritime trade and troop movement, supporting both economic and military functions. Standardized coinage enabled resource distribution, taxation, and trade integration. Administrative documentation, including inscriptions, tax registers, and public decrees, maintained fiscal monitoring and institutional continuity. Infrastructure planning supported the coordination of civic, military, and economic activity within urban centers and surrounding territories. Cultural institutions established during the Greek period continued to operate under adapted oversight structures. Theaters, libraries, educational facilities, and religious sites functioned as central nodes for civic activity. Dramatic performance, historiographical documentation, and systematic philosophical study remained integral to urban life. Schools of inquiry facilitated the study of ethics, logic, governance, and natural phenomena, providing frameworks for the transmission of intellectual traditions. Public archives and libraries preserved records of administrative activity, scientific observation, and artistic production, ensuring continuity of structured knowledge. Scientific practice persisted in institutional settings. Urban observatories facilitated astronomical measurements, while botanical and anatomical studies were conducted systematically. Engineering knowledge, including construction techniques, siegecraft, hydraulic management, and road network design, underpin both urban infrastructure and military operations. Mathematical methods, geometric principles, and surveying techniques supported architecture, land management, and logistical planning. Trade networks established during earlier periods continued to operate efficiently. Maritime routes connected ports across the Aegean, Eastern Mediterranean, and Western Asia. Inland trade routes linked agricultural production centers to urban markets and administrative hubs. Coinage facilitated standardized exchange, taxation, and economic coordination. Marketplaces and urban centers functioned as nodes of commerce, enabling continuous monitoring and movement of goods, resources, and information. Political institutions developed under Hellenistic structures persisted, incorporating elements of prior democratic, oligarchic, and mixed governance models. Assemblies, councils, courts, and magistracies functioned within adapted oversight systems, providing local administration while integrating into regional authority. Legal codes, property regulations, and tax collection procedures maintained orderly civic management. Local governance facilitated routine administration while ensuring coordination with broader territorial oversight. Artistic and architectural production remained active in urban centers. Sculpture emphasized proportion, balance, and anatomical representation. Architecture adhered to post and lintel construction principles, precise measurement, and proportional design. Civic structures, temples, theaters, and stoas demonstrated functional urban planning while maintaining aesthetic standards. Decorative motifs, reliefs, and ceramic production reflected Hellenic artistic principles. Adapted to regional contexts, philosophical and intellectual traditions continued to shape structured inquiry. Educational systems supported systematic study of logic, natural phenomena, ethics, mathematics, and civic governance. Rhetorical instruction and dialectical reasoning provided standardized methods of teaching and civic discourse. Urban centers functioned as institutional hubs for knowledge, ensuring continuity of educational and philosophical frameworks. Urbanization and cultural integration facilitated dissemination of Greek language, coinage, architectural principles, administrative procedures, and scientific practices. Cities functioned as coordinated nodes of civic, military, economic, and cultural activity. Standardization of coinage, weights, and measures supported trade, taxation, and resource allocation across multiple regions. Road and maritime networks connected urban centers, allowing efficient movement of personnel, goods, and information. Military, administrative, and economic structures developed by Greek civilization provided enduring models for subsequent governance. Infantry, cavalry, and auxiliary units retained tactical doctrines established over previous centuries. Logistic systems, including fortified roads, depots, and maritime transport, ensured operational capability across integrated territories. Urban organization, civic institutions, and fiscal mechanisms maintained continuity while adapting to new administrative oversight. Visualizable elements for documentary presentation include infantry formations in coordinated phalanx, cavalry units maneuvering across open terrain or city perimeters, fortified acropolis and garrisoned roads, urban street grids and marketplaces, harbor infrastructure facilitating maritime transport, coinage circulating through commercial networks, libraries, observatories, and educational institutions in operation, and temples and civic structures reflecting Hellenic architectural principles. Geographically, Greek influence persisted across mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, southern Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and western Mediterranean maritime corridors. Urban centers, fortified settlements, river valleys, coastal plains, and mountain passes structured both military operations and economic integration. Seasonal variation influenced agricultural productivity, campaign timing, and resource distribution. By 146 year BC, Greek civilization had completed a transition from independent city-states and Hellenistic territories to integrated regions under centralized authority. Despite political subordination, Greek civic, military, economic, cultural, and scientific frameworks persisted, providing operational, institutional, and intellectual continuity. Urban centers, infrastructure, administrative structures, educational institutions, trade networks, and scientific practices maintain structural integrity, ensuring the transmission of Greek knowledge and organizational models into subsequent eras. The legacy of Greek civilization shaped governance, civic management, military organization, economic coordination, cultural production, and intellectual development across integrated regions. Administrative systems informed urban management, taxation, and legal oversight. Military organization influenced troop structuring, tactical doctrines, and logistical planning. Economic mechanisms, including standardized coinage and trade networks, facilitated regional integration and resource distribution. Civic and cultural institutions ensured continuity of structured education, artistic production, and systematic observation of natural phenomena. Urban settlement patterns, infrastructure, and fortification principles guided future city planning and architectural development. Knowledge transmission was maintained through institutionalized education, libraries, archives, and observatories. Philosophical, mathematical, and scientific practices ensured structured methodologies and empirical approaches were preserved. Administrative records, fiscal documentation, and civic planning facilitated retention of operational knowledge for governance, military organization, and urban management. Civic, military, and economic systems remained interconnected. Urban infrastructure supported logistics, troop movement, and communication. Fortified settlements and garrison roads enabled coordinated operations. Observatories, laboratories, and educational institutions facilitated systematic study and practical application of knowledge. Coinage, trade networks, and taxation mechanisms underpinned economic stability and administrative efficiency. Cultural continuity reinforced institutional memory and social coordination. Public spaces, administrative offices, theaters, libraries, and temples structured civic activity. Educational systems provided methodological training in mathematics, rhetoric, and philosophy, documentation of campaigns, legal activity, and fiscal operations preserved knowledge for future generations. From c. 1600 year BC to 146 year BC, Greek civilization developed integrated military, administrative, economic, civic, scientific, and cultural systems. Despite fragmentation, conquest, and integration under external authority, these systems maintained structural and operational continuity. Civic, military, and cultural frameworks established a foundation for subsequent Roman governance and influenced Mediterranean institutional development. By 146 year BC, Greek civilization had produced durable structural, institutional, and cultural patterns. Military, administrative, economic, civic, scientific, and artistic systems persisted under new governance, ensuring continuity and operational functionality. These frameworks formed the foundation for Roman integration and subsequent European and Mediterranean institutional and intellectual developments. The period solidified Greek civilization's operational, structural, and cultural legacy, ensuring its transmission across geographic and temporal boundaries. The conclusion of ancient Greek civilization in 146 year BC marked a critical transition in Mediterranean history. Although Greek political independence had ended, the structural, institutional, cultural, and intellectual achievements developed over centuries persisted and influenced subsequent civilizations. The legacy of Greek civilization is observable in governance, urban planning, military organization, science, philosophy, arts, and economic systems across the Mediterranean and beyond. Military organization, established through centuries of city-state competition and Hellenistic expansion, remained operationally significant. Infantry formations based on the phalanx model continued to provide strategic coherence, relying on disciplined ranks, shield wall cohesion, and coordinated spear deployment. Cavalry units, light infantry, and missile troops augmented tactical flexibility, enabling combined arms operations in both open terrain and urban environments. Fortified settlements, acropolis, and coastal garrisons provided secure nodes for administration, logistics, and troop deployment. Road networks, supply depots, and maritime routes ensured efficient movement of resources, personnel, and information across wide geographic areas. Urban infrastructure and architectural planning achieved high levels of operational and aesthetic functionality. Cities incorporated orthogonal street grids, centralized marketplaces, administrative buildings, temples, theaters, and defensive walls. Harbor systems facilitated maritime trade, military logistics, and cultural exchange. Standardized coinage enabled the integration of economic systems across regions, facilitating taxation, trade, and resource allocation. Administrative documentation, including inscriptions, registers, and public decrees, supported institutional continuity, fiscal oversight, and legal accountability. Cultural institutions persisted under adapted authority structures, maintaining theaters, educational facilities, libraries, and religious centers as nodes of structured activity. Dramatic performance, historiographical documentation, and philosophical inquiry continued to form integral components of civic life. Schools of inquiry systematically addressed ethics, logic, mathematics, governance, and natural phenomena. Public archives preserved administrative records, scientific observations, and artistic production, ensuring continuity of knowledge and operational methods. Scientific and technological practice remained integral to civic, military, and economic operations. Observatories facilitated astronomical measurements, while anatomical, botanical, and medical studies advanced understanding of natural systems. Engineering knowledge supported urban construction, fortification, hydraulic systems, and transportation networks. Mathematical methods and surveying techniques informed architecture, land management, and infrastructure development, ensuring functional precision in urban planning and military logistics. Trade networks maintained economic cohesion across the Mediterranean, the Aegean, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. Maritime routes enabled transport of grain, metals, textiles, and luxury goods, connecting production centers to urban markets. Inland roads linked agricultural regions with administrative and urban hubs. Standardized coinage supported the uniform exchange of goods, tax collection, and market integration. Marketplaces functioned as centers of commerce, monitoring resource flows and ensuring economic stability. Political and administrative frameworks developed during Greek civilization persisted in integrated territories, Assemblies, councils, magistracies, and courts retained functional structures to manage local governance. Legal codes and property regulations ensured orderly administration, taxation procedures, fiscal monitoring, and regulatory oversight provided structured resource management. Enabling integration into wider administrative systems, civic institutions balanced local autonomy with regional authority. Supporting coordinated governance, artistic production demonstrated continuity of Hellenic style and technical principles. Sculpture emphasized proportion, anatomical accuracy, and balance. Architecture adhered to post and lintel construction, proportional design, and functional planning. Civic buildings, temples, theaters, and stoas reflected organized urban space. Blending operational and aesthetic requirements, decorative motifs, reliefs, and ceramic production continued to express Hellenic artistic principles while incorporating regional influences. Philosophical and educational institutions provided sustained frameworks for structured knowledge acquisition. Schools engaged in systematic investigation of ethics, natural phenomena, logic, mathematics, and governance. Pedagogical practices, including rhetorical instruction, dialectical reasoning, and empirical observation, were standardized and institutionalized. Urban centers functioned as hubs of learning and intellectual continuity, transmitting knowledge across generations and geographic regions. Urbanization and cultural integration ensured dissemination of Greek civic, scientific, administrative, and cultural practices. Cities functioned as nodes of structured activity, integrating military, economic, administrative, and cultural functions. Standardized coinage, weights, and measures facilitated trade, taxation, and resource coordination. Roads and maritime networks connected settlements, enabling the movement of people, goods, and information. Seasonal variations influenced agricultural productivity, resource management, and logistical planning. Military, administrative, economic, and cultural frameworks established by Greek civilization persisted under new governing authorities. Infantry, cavalry, and auxiliary forces retained tactical organization developed over centuries. Logistics, including supply networks, fortified roads, and depots, supported operational capability. Urban organization, infrastructure, civic administration, and fiscal mechanisms were adapted but preserved functional integrity. Visualizable elements for documentary narration include coordinated phalanx formations, cavalry maneuvers, fortified acropolis and garrisoned roads, orthogonal city grids, marketplaces and harbors, libraries and observatories in operation, temples and civic buildings reflecting Hellenic architectural principles, and coinage circulating through economic networks. These visual cues reinforce structured operational and cultural continuity. Geographically, Greek influence extended from mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands to Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and Western Mediterranean corridors. Coastal cities, river valleys, mountain passes, and fortified settlements structured military, economic, and administrative operations. Urban centers functioned as nodes of integrated activity, linking agricultural, industrial, and civic production. By 146 Year BCE, Greek civilization had completed a transition from autonomous city-states and Hellenistic regions to integrated territories under external authority. Despite political subordination, Greek civic, military, economic, cultural, and scientific frameworks persisted, providing operational and intellectual continuity. Urban centers, administrative structures, educational institutions, trade networks, and scientific facilities maintained structural integrity, ensuring the transmission of Greek systems into subsequent periods. The legacy of Greek civilization influenced governance, urban management, military organization, economic frameworks, cultural production, and intellectual development. Administrative practices informed urban planning, taxation, and legal oversight. Military organization shaped troop structure, tactical doctrines, and logistics. Economic mechanisms, including standardized coinage and trade networks, ensured resource integration and stability. Civic and cultural institutions sustained structured education. Artistic production and empirical observation, urban design, infrastructure, and fortifications guided future city planning and architectural development. Knowledge transmission was ensured through libraries, archives, observatories, and schools. Philosophical, mathematical, and scientific traditions preserved systematic methods and empirical study. Administrative and fiscal records documented governance and resource management, maintaining operational knowledge for subsequent administrations. Civic, military, and economic systems were interlinked. Urban infrastructure supported logistical coordination, troop movement, and communication. Fortified settlements and garrison roads enabled coordinated military operations. Educational and scientific institutions facilitated systematic investigation and practical application of knowledge. Coinage, trade, and taxation mechanisms supported economic stability and administrative efficiency. Cultural continuity reinforced institutional memory. Public spaces, administrative buildings, theaters, libraries, and temples structured civic activity. Educational institutions provided systematic training in mathematics, rhetoric, and philosophy, documentation of campaigns, legal activity, and fiscal operations preserved operational knowledge for future generations. From c. 1600 year BC to 146 year BC, Greek civilization established integrated military, administrative, economic, civic, scientific, and cultural systems. Despite political fragmentation, conquest, and integration under external authority, these systems maintained structural and operational continuity. Civic, military, and cultural frameworks formed the foundation for Roman integration and influenced Mediterranean institutional and intellectual developments. By 146 year BC, Greek civilization had produced durable structural, institutional, and cultural patterns. Military, administrative, economic, civic, scientific, and artistic systems persisted under new governance. These frameworks formed the foundation for Roman administration and subsequent Mediterranean and European institutional and intellectual structures. The period solidified Greek operational, cultural, and intellectual legacy, ensuring transmission across geographic and temporal boundaries.